Hello, everyone. Well, I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Freedom Project, which is co-sponsoring this lecture by Jennifer Doleac of Texas A&M University, along with the Department of Economics. And we're very excited to have her here and to be able to collaborate with our friends in the Economics Department. And this is our Freedom Project kickoff event for the year. So, it's an exciting moment. And I also wanted to say to any students in the audience, if you or other students that you know have an interest in becoming Adam Smith Fellows for the Freedom Project, our application process is going on right now. And applications can be found on the Freedom Project website, on the Wellesley College website. And they're not due until next Monday, so there's plenty of time to apply. And we welcome students from any class year, especially students who are near the beginning of their Wellesley careers. So please consider joining us as a student fellows. We have a wonderful program that includes a week of winter session and eligibility for some really exciting internships and a year-long seminar program. Anyway, enough advertising for the Freedom Project. I'm going to let the chair of the Economics Department, Kristen Butcher, introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Gabby. I think you can probably hear me if I don't use the microphone. So when Kathy asked me if we might like to collaborate on bringing in a person, I was very excited about that, and I was particularly delighted because Jen Doleac immediately sprang to mind. Jen is the appropriate person to do this for many, many reasons. One, she's a proud liberal arts college graduate, an econ and math major from Williams College, and then she went on to Stanford for her PhD in economics. She is recently departed from the Batten School, the public policy school at UVA, and she's now at Texas A&M. And she's joined their fine group of microeconomists. In her heart of hearts, I think she's really a public policy person because what she likes to do is think hard about what are the daunting questions that face society and then gather new data to examine those issues and to try to come up with important answers. And some of the things she's looked at are things like what's the impact of juvenile curfews on gun violence in urban areas? What's the impact of DNA databases on crime and recidivism? And I think it's really appropriate for the Freedom Project because it turns out that no matter how well-intentioned the policy, sometimes the answer is no, it didn't work. And I think we as researchers need to have the space to ask those questions even when the answers are uncomfortable or not what we predicted. And I thought I would just quote Angus Deaton, 2015 Nobel Prize winner in economics, from his book, The Great Escape. He said, "Unless we understand how the numbers are put together and what they mean, we run the risk of seeing problems when there are none, of missing urgent and addressable needs, of being outraged by fantasies while overlooking real horrors, and recommending policies that are fundamentally misconceived." So I think that Jen tries to address all of those issues and bring really rigorous methods, creative data to bear on some of our most difficult problems. So with that, I will let her talk to you about ban the box policies.
Thank you, Kristen, so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's been really fun to be here. As Kristen mentioned, I went to Williams myself, so I always love coming back to a liberal arts college. I feel like the students and the faculty that find themselves at a place like this are just very special, and so it's always nice to visit, and especially a place with such a fine econ department. So I'm going to talk about Ban the Box today. Mostly the unintended consequences of the policy and the research showing what the impacts have been. And toward the end, I'll get into a little bit more of like what we should do instead, because I think that's in these conversations it often gets lost that it's not like this or nothing, right? It's this or maybe something better. And so I think that's an important role for a scholar to play, is to think about what better we could do. So the problem that Ban the Box, the policy and research about it are trying to address is that in the United States, recidivism rates are really, really high. So there's been a general movement in this country away from mass incarceration, at least in in terms of the policies that we'd like to see. We are all very motivated at this point to reduce our reliance on mass incarceration as a crime reduction tool. So the good news is that people are now being released from prison faster than they're being admitted. There are over 600,000 people released each year in this country back into their communities. The bad news is the most recent data suggests that 2/3 of those people who are released will be rearrested within 3 years, and about half will be reincarcerated. So obviously, if we want to get traction on reducing mass incarceration, we're going to have to break that reincarceration cycle. These graphs at the bottom show you, this is the population that's incarcerated and under supervision in the country. You can see there's like a general decline in more recent years. We are making progress there. But that line on the graph on the right shows the percent of released prisoners who are rearrested by year of release on that x-axis. So very high recidivism rates. And the other problem that people see in this space is that it seems like having a criminal record makes it really difficult to get a job. So there's a general sense, I think, that employment could help people desist from crime, could help people earn legal income, provide better structure to their day that could help keep them out of trouble, all things that could contribute to building a stable life outside of the criminal justice system. So I'll talk more later about how the evidence on that is, the theory is clearer than the evidence, I guess. But we do have very strong evidence that employers are very reluctant to hire people with criminal records. So this graph is from a landmark paper by Diva Pager from 2003, where she sent job applicants, actors, in to apply for entry-level jobs. And they were either black or white, and then she randomized whether the application that they had signaled that they had a criminal record or not. And in general, one of the more striking findings that is talked a lot about in this paper is you can just see the gap between callbacks between white and black applicants. Black applicants overall, those are the two bars on the left, were called back at much lower rates than white applicants. But the main point of the study was that the people with criminal records are called back at lower rates than people without criminal records for both races. And so this idea that holding everything else constant, but having some people who randomly had a criminal record versus not, the employers really seemed to think that a criminal record was a negative signal of something and seemed to be very worried about that. So we're much less likely to respond positively to those applications. And so if employers are discriminating against people with criminal records because of racial disparities and who has a record in this country, this is going to have a disparate impact on Black and Hispanic men. So these graphs show, again, the most recent data. Unfortunately, this is just from 2003. Data in this broad research area is not that great. But these data suggest that for Black men, the lifetime chance of being incarcerated is about 32%. It's about 1 in 3. For Hispanic men, it's 17%. For white men, it's about 6%. On the right-hand side, the same graph for women, which all those rates are much lower, but you see the same racial disparities. And so in general, if anytime employers are going to condition a job on having a clean record, that's going to disproportionately hurt Black and Hispanic men, who are much more likely to have a record than people from other groups. And so the next question that is interesting, I think, to researchers certainly, and I wish were more interesting to policymakers, is why employers discriminate against people with criminal records. And the reason this question is interesting and important, I think, is that the answer to that question will help us devise a more effective remedy. So my hunch, and this is very much the research frontier, kind of this part of the question and the potential answers, but my hunch is that most employers just want to hire reliable, productive employees. They want someone who's going to show up on time every morning and do a good job. Most probably don't care about that criminal record itself, but they view the criminal record as being a proxy for other negative characteristics that they're not able to directly observe. Especially for entry-level jobs, there isn't that much information on the job application. You can't tell, even with an interview, whether someone's likely to be on time every day, and so on. And so the types of things that might be difficult to observe on the application or even during the interview are things like productivity, reliability, and honesty. So using a criminal record as a proxy for those things that they can't see is what economists call statistical discrimination. It's not discriminating based on the criminal record itself, but because the criminal record is associated statistically with other things that they actually do care about. And so some of you might be wondering whether a criminal record is actually correlated with any of these things, any of these dimensions of work readiness. And that's a really difficult question to answer. We unfortunately don't have the data that we would need to be able to answer that very clearly. But I think there are several reasons to think that it probably is correlated. We know that on average, people with criminal records have less education, they have less work experience and interrupted work histories, especially if they were incarcerated. They have higher rates of mental illness, substance abuse, emotional trauma. All of those things could be made worse by the experience of incarceration. And the high recidivism rates that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation mean that someone who is recently convicted and recently released is very likely to be arrested again in the near future. And that could take them off the job without warning if for an employer who's just looking for someone to show up every day at 9 a.m. and do a good job, suddenly that person doesn't show up because they were arrested, and that's a problem for them. So let me give you a little bit more information on kind of what we do know about this population. And again, a big challenge in studying this stuff is data availability. There's no national survey. If you think about like the census and the big data sets that we usually think of that answer a lot of questions about characteristics in the population, none of those surveys ask, do you have a criminal record? And so it's amazing how little we actually know about this population, and that really hinders progress in this area. But increasingly, researchers have been getting more and more creative about finding data sets that can help us answer those. So this data is from the NLSY, which has some information on self-reported criminal history and other outcomes. And this just shows you that people who, this shows you the percent of people who were ever incarcerated by education level. So you can see the people who did not complete high school have a very high chance of being incarcerated. In general, this is just a group that has low education. It's also a group that has high rates of substance abuse. So you can see the rates that for people the rates of state prisoners and sentenced jail inmates in the first two bars that meet the criteria for substance abuse and substance dependence. And the adult general population is all the way on the right, much lower. And then similar data for rates of mental illness. So people coming into jail or prison have high rates of serious psychological distress, histories of mental health problems, and so on, at rates that are much higher than the adult general population. Another challenge that employers might be worried about is liability. If you talk to small business owners, this comes up a lot. Unfortunately, it's an area where we have almost no data to know whether this is how big of a concern this actually is in reality in terms of what the chances of being sued are. But employers definitely seem to worry about it a lot. And so the general idea here is that hiring someone with a criminal record could put you at risk for a negligent hiring lawsuit if that person then goes on to commit a crime while they're on the job. Even if it doesn't lead to a lawsuit, it could lead to lots of bad press. That could be equally bad for the employer. And so most state laws and EEOC guidelines that guide hiring practices in the country basically just tell, the guidance that employers get is that they should use reasonable judgment when considering a criminal record in the context of job responsibilities. Employers are not allowed to have a blanket ban on hiring people with a criminal record. That has a very clear disparate impact, and that's just not allowed. So employers have to consider the criminal record in the context of the job responsibilities they'd be doing on the job. The problem here is that if someone commits another crime while they're on the job, and the worst case scenario here is they assault a customer or something like a violent crime. The problem is any previous conviction at that point could look like a red flag to a jury or a judge. Once you know that this person went on to commit another crime, you could say, well, the employer should have known, they were obviously hanging out with bad people and so on. And so that risk of the lawsuit, of bad press, could be catastrophic for the employer. It could put them out of business. And so it makes sense that if they have applicants from people without criminal records, employers, even if the risk of that kind of event is low, a rational employer would opt for the person without a record instead of the person with a record if given the chance, just to be safe. So with all of that background in mind, let's talk about Ban the Box. So Ban the Box is a very popular policy in this country. It's been caught on quickly and has been expanding dramatically over the past decade or so. It can be implemented at the city, county, or state level. It can be implemented, again, for just government jobs, so public ban the box laws. It can be implemented for contractors that have contracts with the government or all private employers in a particular location. And the basic idea is that they prohibit employers from asking a job applicant about their criminal history until late in the hiring process, usually until after a conditional offer's been made. So it's named after, traditionally on job applications, there's a box you have to check that says, check this box if you've ever been convicted of a crime, and then usually it would give you space to explain. So give some information about what the crime was, how long ago it was, whatever. And so there's been a big movement to, because people don't like that employers are asking this question, there's been a movement to ban that box. The primary goal is to help some applicants with criminal records get their foot in the door, build rapport with the employer during an interview. They have a chance to signal their work readiness. So if the problem at this point is that there are some work-ready people with criminal records who never get the chance to get their foot in the door because employers just automatically throw out that application, as in that Diva Pager study, then some of those people now will get their foot in the door and have a chance to convince the employer that they would make a good employee, and then the hope is that by the time the employer then goes and checks their criminal background, which they probably will, they'll see that person as a whole person and not just someone with a criminal record. And so the hope is some of those people will get jobs. The secondary goal here is to reduce racial disparities in employment. Because of the disparate impact of conditioning a job on having a clean record, we think if employers stop doing that, then that should kind of equalize employment rates at least somewhat. So this is a super popular policy. By the summer of 2018, ban the box policies were in effect in 34 states and 150 cities and counties across the country. President Obama also very prominently banned the box on federal job applications in late 2015. So this has been a real, I think the ban the box rallying cry really became sort of a slogan for a social movement encouraging second chances for people with criminal records. So here's a map. This map's a bit outdated at this point, but I don't know of a more recent one. This goes through December 2015. So you can see it's a lot of cities. It tends to be a very urban policy, but also a set of states that aren't usually grouped together. You've got Minnesota, and at the same time you've got California and Georgia, right? So it's just a whole bunch of different places. And in general here, criminal justice policy, including a movement to increase second chances, and in particular for ban the box, has been really pushed by both liberals and conservatives. Part of the reason I like working on criminal justice policy is there's really no right and left in this area. I think there's so much work to be done, and we're so far from an optimal solution that everyone's happy with a little bit of movement toward a better outcome. So, the Coke Industries, for instance, has been a major proponent of ban the box. Okay, so we know that conditioning employment on having a clean record will disproportionately hurt groups that contain more people with criminal records. That's the disparate impact I mentioned. It'll have a disparate impact on Black men. This leads some people, especially lawyers like to talk about this a lot, to think that we can solve that problem by telling employers not to use that information anymore. Okay, so if the use of some information has a disparate impact, the policy intervention is don't use that information anymore. So what happens when we remove information that employers care about? Economic theory suggests that they will then statistically discriminate against groups that are more likely to have the traits that they want to avoid. So if you tell them they can't ask anymore, they might try to guess, essentially. And this has the effect of broadening the discrimination from some members of that group to the entire group, and ultimately hurting disadvantaged groups more than it helps them. So there's research evidence of this happening in other contexts. There's a paper by Abby Wozniak looking at the impacts of allowing employer drug testing on employment. And she found that when employers were allowed to drug test employees, Black employment increased dramatically in those states. Credit check bans have a similar effect. When employers are not allowed to check job applicants' credit scores, they use race as a proxy, and Black job applicants are less likely to be hired. And finally, it turns out there's this whole other literature looking at what happened when we first increased access to criminal records on employment. So this is a relatively new problem that we're trying to solve. Until the internet and cheap computer memory, it was very difficult for employers to check whether someone had a criminal record. And so there are a number of economists who've looked at what happened to employment for different groups when criminal records became more accessible to employers. And they generally found that what happened is that more Black men were hired because employers seemed to be using race as a proxy for having a criminal record when they weren't able to check. And so we know that Ban the Box aims to increase employment for people with criminal records by preventing employers from asking about criminal histories until late in the process. But it doesn't address employers' concerns about hiring people with criminal records. And so in this context where they still don't want to hire someone with a criminal record, but now they're not allowed to ask, we might just increase statistical discrimination against groups that are more likely to have records, especially recent records. So in this case, we'd be very concerned about young, low-skilled Black men. And so there are now 2 studies that have found that Ban the Box is in fact increasing discrimination based on race. So, and I'll talk about each of them in turn. So the first one is by Amanda Egan and Sonia Starr. This is a really nice, clean field experiment where they sent out job applications for fictitious job applicants before and after Ban the Box went into effect in New York City and New Jersey. And they randomized whether the applicant was Black or white using racially stereotypical names to signal race, and also randomizing whether they had a criminal record. And I think they used definitely nonviolent felony convictions. I think they randomized whether it was drug or property. It turned out that didn't matter at all. But these were all nonviolent offenders. And what you can see is these are all before Ban the Box. So the blue bars are Black applicants, the green bars are white applicants. You can see that in these locations, New York City and New Jersey, contrary to the Diva Pager study, there's no independent race effect. So white and Black applicants with a criminal record are called back at essentially equal rates, and white and Black applicants without a criminal record are called back at equal rates. So it's just interesting that they found such a different race effect, maybe different context, different state, all that sort of stuff. But there's definitely a difference between people with and without criminal records, right? Employers are definitely reluctant to call back people with criminal records. So what happens when we take the box away? The white applicants are called back, if at anything, a slightly higher rate than the white applicants without a record were before. The Black applicants are called back at a rate that's in between these 2 bars, which is what we'd expect if employers are assuming that Black applicants are some of them have records and some don't, and so they they're calling back sort of a weighted average of those 2. But then that's where the racial gap really opens up. So suddenly we see that the racial gap between callback rates for Black and white applicants increases 6-fold. So Ban the Box created a racial gap in callbacks in these locations. And then I have a paper with Ben Hansen where, so one more part on this. So these are the outcomes that they're able to look at here are callbacks. So whether an employment, because these are fake job applications, right? So it's a really nice, clean experiment. That's the advantage. The downside is they can't see who actually got a job. And the question is, are the people who are getting the callbacks all going to get jobs? And if some of them have criminal records, it's not clear that once the employers check the record, they're actually going to get the job at the end. So that's sort of a big question in this context that's really important to get at. So Ben Hansen and I use the gradual rollout of Ban the Box policies across the country as a natural experiment. It's a less clean experiment. It's definitely not randomized, right? The laws are implemented not at random across the country, as much as we all might wish, as researchers might wish that were the case. But we can use a pretty standard statistical method to try to control for pre-existing trends between different places and look at what happens to employment for different groups in particular labor markets before and after ban the box goes into effect. And what we find is that ban the box reduces employment for Black men by about 5% and reduced employment for Hispanic men by 3%. Had no effect on white men overall, although when we focus on ban the box laws that target private firms, we see an increase in hiring for white men, and that's consistent with the Egg and Star study. So it looks like, especially the combination of these two studies side by side, I think is really nice because we have a really kind of two very different empirical approaches to the same question, and they both give us the same answer, which is what you're always hoping for from any kind of academic literature. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about kind of what we do in that second study. We're using data from the Current Population Survey for 2004 to 2015. This is a survey that includes a lot of information about the individual respondents, age, race, education, all that kind of stuff, in addition to whether or not they're employed. It doesn't include information on criminal history. As I mentioned, none of these big data sets include that question. So we're just going to be looking at what's the average effect for people in different demographic groups. We're restricting our sample to just white non-Hispanic, Black non-Hispanic, and Hispanic individuals, since we're really interested in these racial effects. We're going to focus our main estimates on looking at young, low-skilled men, so men ages 25 to 34 without a college degree. And then we're thinking of ban the box as being a treatment at the labor market level. So we're looking at what happens in the metropolitan statistical area you live in. So essentially, if ban the box goes into effect in any place in your MSA, we're going to say you're potentially treated by this policy. And that's a really conservative way to code things. It should bias us against finding anything. If you like equations, this slide is for you. If you don't, you can just ignore this slide, and I'll talk more intuitively about what we're doing. But basically, we're estimating the probability that any individual in our data set is employed. We're going to control for MSA fixed effects, individual demographic characteristics in a very flexible way, as much information as we can, so to soak up a lot of variation in different employment outcomes. We're including time by region fixed effects, which basically means we're allowing shocks, like monthly shocks at the region level in employment. And what we're really trying to control for as flexibly as possible here is during the 2004 to 2014 period, you might recall there's a big recession. And so we're trying to control for, soak up as much of that variation as possible so it's not correlated with the policy we're trying to measure. And then we also have MSA-specific time trends. To try to account for employment trends that were pre-existing. And then in our main specification, we're going to interact all of that stuff with race and ethnicity. So allow all those things to vary with whether you're Black or Hispanic or white. So this means that for each 25 to 34-year-old man in our sample, we are adjusting for the employment probability for men of the same race or ethnicity in his MSA, the employment trend for that race or ethnicity in the MSA, monthly region-specific employment shocks, and again, here we're thinking of the housing crash, and his individual characteristics. What's left is idiosyncratic individual level shocks. So imagine you get into a fight with your supervisor, you get sick. Those things should not be correlated with ban the box, and so those are just sort of random noise in whether or not you're employed in a given month. And then you have local level employment shocks, and that's things like ban the box policies. So our identifying assumption here, what this study is the assumption that will allow us to interpret our estimates as causal, is that there are no other local employment shocks that coincide with the adoption of ban the box. Now, this is where it becomes important that ban the box is not random, right? We think the most likely threat to our identification here is that ban the box was adopted in places that were motivated to help people with criminal records and to improve employment outcomes for young, low-skilled Black men as a group. So we think that, even if some place was really motivated to pass this policy, for some reason the policy didn't pass, that motivation alone should have helped those groups do better in the labor market going forward. So we're going to be confounding somewhat the motivation that led them to pass ban the box with the effect of ban the box. This should bias our results toward finding beneficial effects of the policy. Okay, so here are our main results. The blue outline is showing our very our preferred specification with all those controls. We're finding that for white men, there's a non-significant, very small effect on employment. For black men, there's a reduction in employment of 3.4 percentage points, 5%. For Hispanic men, it's about 3%. And then we can think about restricting the sample to other groups to try to see how sensitive those results are to different types of assumptions and maybe samples that are more similar to places that adopted ban the box. So one thing is, in that initial map I showed you, this is a very urban policy. Most of the places that passed this policy were cities. And so in the overall sample, we have a lot of rural areas in there. You might think those are never going to be good controls. So let's just restrict the sample to places that are only in MSAs. Well, we can do that in that second set of results, and you can see the results are very similar. They really don't change much at all. The third set of results is restricting the sample to places that adopt ban the box at some point during this period. So this sample this set of results might be of more interest to you if you think that the types of places that adopt ban the box are just fundamentally different from the places that don't. These are just places that maybe they have more racial diversity or they have just more motivation to do something about racial disparities. And so here we're going to be identifying entirely off of when you adopt ban the box, not if you do or not. And here the results are almost identical. We lose the significant effect on Hispanic men, but that effect is sort of borderline anyway, not always significant. And the last thing we do is actually control for local monthly unemployment rates. Now this is a little tricky because we're actually trying to measure here, right, is local employment outcomes, and so controlling for local unemployment is only going to work if this policy was not reducing overall unemployment, not reducing employment overall. It's just shifting jobs from one person to another. But ultimately, so it's a little problematic, and we kind of ran it, tentatively, but it's certainly a good check for making sure that there wasn't just our results weren't the result of some other local shock to employment that we were unable to soak up with our variation. And you can see sort of remarkably, even when we control for local monthly unemployment rates, we see almost no effect on our results. So they hold up even under that scenario. So we're pretty confident that we've isolated the causal effect of this policy on employment rates for these different groups, and it really seems, the punchline is that this policy really seems to hurt young black men who don't have a college degree. So this shows the effects over time. You can see there's the red line is when ban the box started. So for white men, there's really nothing going on. For black men, it's hovering around 0, maybe even a little positive, which suggests that it's consistent with this being sort of a positively selected group of places that wind up adopting this policy. But 0, and then it starts declining and continues to go down. For Hispanic men, coverage rate's much noisier, which is why we find those marginally significant effects. But hovering around 0, and then you see, this will become more clear in the next table, a little bit of a dip, and then it goes back to 0 after a couple of quarters. And so this table shows you those effects just estimated year by year. So, because you might think, maybe ban the box is just a short-term employment shock, right? So maybe it changes the information. Employers are used to hiring people with a certain system, and it's just going to, now the government comes in and says you have to use this other system that you can't ask this question anymore that you're relying on. It's just going to take everyone a little while to adjust to this new set of rules. If that's the case, you would expect a short-term shock and then going back to the original levels. So for white men overall, when you go ban the box 0 to 1 year after it was passed, then 1 to 2 years, then 2 to 3 years, 3 to 4 years, and so on. For white men, there's never an effect here for ban the box overall. For black men, you see the effect starts the small negative and then grows over time and doesn't seem to go away, right? Even 4+ years out, we're still at a negative 8 percentage points shock to employment. For Hispanic men, it's much more interesting. So it's small negative becomes a marginally significant negative 3 percentage points, and then starts going back down to 0, kind of what you saw on that graph. And this suggests that for Hispanic men, they seem to figure out how to get jobs into the new system. They seem to find some other way to signal to employers that they're a good bet, that they should hire them. And this is I think, an interesting result that we don't have a really clear answer or really clear explanation for, but it's consistent with other evidence that Hispanic men are more likely to use their networks to find jobs than African American men are. And so if you think about what other ways you might signal to an employer that you'd be a good bet, having someone vouch for you is a potentially good way. So that might be what's going on there. One of the big challenge in this study was that we had to figure out how to deal very flexibly with that recession and make sure we're controlling for external shocks to the labor market. But the fact that unemployment rates changed so much during this period gave us a little bit of a natural experiment to consider the effects of ban the box under different scenarios. And so the idea here is that employers have more power to discriminate against different groups or against broad groups when there are lots of other applicants for a job, right? If you have 100 applicants for any one job, you can throw out a huge portion of those applications and still have people to choose from. If you have 2 applicants for every one job, you probably have to give everybody a chance. And so we can look at what happens, what the effect of ban the box is at different national unemployment rates. And we can see that the effect is larger and more negative. It's more negative and more significant when unemployment is higher, which is consistent with that idea that employers just have more power to discriminate at those times. And then another nice feature of this data set is that, at least for a subset of the overall sample, we can follow people over time. So we can follow the same respondent over time to see how their employment changes. And our hypothesis here is that ban the box is reducing employment by making it harder for job applicants to find jobs. It should not be reducing employment by leading to more people to lose jobs, right? If we're finding that the effects are driven by job losers, that suggests maybe we're not controlling for enough stuff. So we can follow people over time and then test the effect of ban the box separately for people who previously reported being unemployed or previously reported being employed. And so when we do that, this is, it's suggestive, the sample gets much smaller for a variety of reasons, but the directions of the effects are certainly what we would expect. We see that the effect of ban the box is a big negative number for those who previously said that they were unemployed. For people who previously reported being employed, it's a much smaller effect and a little bit positive, which is kind of consistent with either they stayed in those jobs because they couldn't find another job, or maybe their previous employment became a more positive signal that allowed them to be more likely to find more work going forward. And then, this is not a job creation policy, certainly, ban the box, and it's not entirely clear that we would expect jobs to be just shifted from one person to another, because it might be that this is just increasing how costly it is for employers to hire, to find employees. But it's possible that employers are just substituting one group for another. So instead of hiring young black men, they're hiring someone else, right? And so the question is, who else might they be hiring? And especially if they're interested in avoiding hiring people who are actively involved in crime, for instance, older applicants, women, and people with college degrees would all be good bets, in addition to white men, which is sort of our main hypothesis. And so you can see that overall, what seems to be happening is that, at least in this data set, the winners from ban the box seem to be older men without a college degree. It looks like black women with a college degree are more likely to be employed. And that we're still a little bit unclear what's going on there, because it's unlikely. It seems unlikely to me they'd be in the same jobs, but maybe it's an inter-household bargaining sort of thing. And then older Hispanic women without a college degree seem to be hired instead of young black men. Although, as I mentioned at the very beginning, when we look specifically at ban the box laws targeting private firms, we see that young white men are more likely to be employed. So this is where we see a big positive effect on employment for young white men. So it seems like the story overall is that when we look at ban the box as a whole, across all policies, employers seem to be substituting from young black men to older black men, older Hispanic women. For private firms that a ban the box applies to, they seem to be substituting from young black men to young white men. And that's consistent with the effect from Egan and Starr, which was also looking at private ban the box laws. Okay, so that evidence in the Eggen and Starr paper hopefully has convinced you that there are big unintended negative effects of this policy on minority men without records. So basically, because employers are discriminating against all men in that group, young black men and young Hispanic men who don't have records, who would have gotten jobs before, are now not getting a chance to interview. Now, some people might consider that worth it if it's helping some people with records find jobs. All right, so if the main concern here is prisoner reentry, we want to try to increase employment for people with criminal records. Maybe there's a trade-off that would be worth it to some people in this room or in the legislature. So the question then is, what happens to people with criminal records? And we're not able to see that in our data set. Again, we don't see in the CPS who has a criminal record and who doesn't. So this was a research question for other folks. And there are now 2 really good studies where the researchers connected or linked administrative data on employment with administrative data on criminal records in 2 states to look at what the impacts of Ban the Box were in those places. 2 economists at the Boston Fed found that Ban the Box seemed to actually reduce employment for people with criminal records in Massachusetts. This is consistent with the idea that everyone's now wasting their time interviewing for jobs they're not going to get. So they might have gotten a job before if they kind of knew where to focus their energies, but now they're not. And the other study is by Evan Rose. He got data from Washington State and found that Ban the Box had no impact on any employment outcomes for people with criminal records in Seattle. So the story here is Ban the Box is not helping people with criminal records, and it's actively hurting young black men who don't have criminal records. And so what could we do instead? And this is where it matters why employers are discriminating in the first place, right? So if employers are statistically discriminating against people with criminal records because they're actually worried about unobservable characteristics like productivity that they can't see, then other policies could be more effective at helping that group without the unintended consequences that Ban the Box had. And the key here is going to be figuring out what it is employers are worried about and then directly addressing those concerns. So actually providing more information rather than less, which importantly is the opposite of lawyers' typical prescription to remove information that has a disparate impact. I'm saying if we see some information has a disparate impact, it could be more useful to provide more information rather than taking that information away. So what are some options in terms of providing more information? One is to provide better signals about job applicants' employability or work readiness. Some examples are rehabilitation certificates. These are court-issued certificates where you can go before a judge and if you have a criminal record and present evidence of your rehabilitation. You can have character witnesses, you can have drug test results, you can have certificates from different training programs. And if the judge is convinced, they can give you a certificate that they can then show to an employer or a landlord to distinguish them from other applicants who have a criminal record. So that's one possible area that's kind of been tried in a few different places. Another possibility in this category would be graduation from a really respected reentry program. And you see this sort of thing happen informally in a lot of cities across the country where some program will essentially set up a pipeline to local employers. Employers learn that anyone they hire from this program is a really good bet. And so it becomes a good signal, even if that program doesn't actually provide more skills, if they're doing the initial screening to get into the program, then employers know that people who came from that program are going to be really good. And so if they're credible, signals like this could be much more valuable to employers than the criminal record they were using as a proxy before, right? So this is going to be much better information to employers about the stuff they actually care about. Another way we could provide more information is by clarifying employers' legal responsibilities in hiring to reduce their liability concerns. So again, rehabilitation certificates, and I'll tell you more about these in the next few slides, could be useful. You're essentially shifting the risk from employers to the courts that are issuing the certificates. Automatic expungement could also be useful here. So an expunged record cannot be used as the basis for a negligent hiring lawsuit. So increasing, a lot of states are thinking about increasing automatic expungement. If you haven't committed another crime within 5 or 10 years, say, then your record would not be available to employers. Something like that could be useful if if legal liability is the main concern, something like that could backfire if they're using a criminal record as information, as a proxy for productivity. So this is where it really matters, figuring out which of these things employers care about and experimenting with all this stuff. So the goal here is to distinguish applicants who are an unnecessary risk from those who aren't, and again, shifting risk from employers to the courts or to government so that employers aren't trying to figure out, who aren't taking it all on themselves and incentivized to be really risk averse and just avoiding hiring people with records. All right. So I've colored headings there for the other policies that to distinguish them from the ban the box stuff. So rehabilitation certificates. So I already mentioned they're court-issued certificates to demonstrate rehabilitation. They could provide a credible signal about work readiness. They could also provide protection from legal liability. So if you're an employer who hires someone with a rehabilitation certificate and that person then goes on to commit a crime on the job, you can say, hey, look, he had the certificate. There's no way I could have known. Go talk to the judge who gave it to him. He's the one it's his fault. So it could be protection from a lawsuit or bad press. And so there are some researchers who looked at the impacts of these certificates in Ohio, and they did an audit study similar to the Egg and Star study, where they sent out applications from fictitious applicants, randomizing whether you had no criminal record at all, a year-old felony conviction, or a year-old felony conviction with a rehabilitation certificate. And what they found was that these two groups were called back at essentially equivalent rates. So the rehabilitation certificates actually seem to have wiped out the effect of the criminal record. It did what Ban the Box was hoping to do and get people's foot in the door. And they repeated the experiment looking at housing as an outcome. So here it's a little trickier to send fake applications for housing. And so what they did was call landlords and pretend to be someone with a year-old felony conviction, a year-old misdemeanor, a felony conviction with a certificate, or a 10-year-old felony. And they said, would you be willing to consider an application for me? And if they said yes, they counted that as a positive outcome. If they said no, then they counted that as a negative outcome. And so you can see that, I also really like that they divided up between whether the landlords or property managers they called were apartments or houses. So I think this kind of gets at the liability concerns. If it's an apartment, you've got a lot of other people around. Liability might be more of an issue. If it's a house, you're just mostly worried about paying the rent on time, not trashing the place, I guess. So you can see that for people with a year-old felony conviction, the positive responses were low, especially for people in apartments. This is the same conviction with a certificate. It increased the rates of yeses for both of those outcomes pretty dramatically. And almost to the point of being equivalent to a misdemeanor. I think it's also interesting here to see the difference between, employers definitely and landlords definitely seem to distinguish between a really recent conviction and one that's 10 years old and so on. And I think it often gets lost in the discussion and people think that employers are it's just a blanket discrimination against anyone with a criminal record. They realize that these are different things. So the punchline here is that these court-issued certificates do get people with criminal records in the door for both job interviews and housing. We don't have evidence yet on recidivism, so that's very much an open question here. And we also don't know why they're valuable exactly. Is it valuable because it's coming from a court? Is it because it's protecting them from lawsuits? Is it because it's a signal of work readiness? And if it's really about the legal liability concerns, then that might be a reason that we would not expect as positive effects to be as large if they came from nonprofits, for instance, instead of the courts. So this is sort of, again, the research frontier. I think we'll see more studies in this area going forward. But it's a really nice ray of hope in this area, an example of something that could work by providing more information rather than taking information away. Another way that we can think about helping people with criminal records find jobs is actually doing something to improve the average productivity of people with criminal records, right? So the unintended consequences of Ban the Box came from, and employers discriminating against people with criminal records is coming from employers associating having a criminal record with being a worse employee. And so the less they associate a criminal record with productivity, the less they're going to care about it in the first place. And so the interventions here require a whole lot more money and effort. We need to do things like invest in evidence-based programs that improve productivity, job training, education, that kind of thing, improve access to medical care, mental health care, substance abuse treatment to address the needs of this population, and in addition to things like stable housing and childcare and transportation. And unfortunately, we don't know much about what's effective in these spaces. There are a lot of these programs out there, and most of them haven't been evaluated. So there's a lot to do here. But let me talk a little bit about just two examples where there is some reliable evidence, just very quickly. So one is transitional jobs programs, another is cognitive behavioral therapy. So transitional jobs programs, you might think that the best way to help people get a job, is, if we really care about that as an outcome, is we could just give them jobs, right? So these are temporary jobs in the nonprofit sector. You get paid for 6 months, and the idea is we'll help you transition to the private sector. There have been some really nice randomized control trials now that look at the impacts of these types of programs. They all find something with this pattern. So basically, people who are randomized in the treatment group get a job, and they show up to work at pretty high rates for the 6 months of the job, and then it drops off, and it's basically down to the level of the control groups. There's no long-term impact on employment. There are a couple of different programs like that. And there's also, this is another one where there's a much smaller sample, so it's a bit noisier, but the same pattern. There's also pretty limited impact on recidivism. So there's no significant effect on reincarceration, a little bit of an effect on arrest, but you're going from a 70% chance of being arrested again to a 65% chance. So it's not exactly like changing your life for the vast majority of people. One reason this could be really ineffective is just that even in these jobs, the earnings are really low. It could be something about the experience of working with a bunch of other people in a transitional jobs program might not be it just might not be the same as getting a real private sector job. We do have some evidence that being released when the low-skill labor market is really strong reduces recidivism. So it seems in conflict with this evidence that just giving people a job doesn't reduce recidivism and doesn't increase employment. But it could be that those private sector jobs are just different in some way. It could also be that those private sector jobs are actually helping the friends and family of people being released, and they themselves are not getting these jobs. So this is a little bit of an open question here about what's going on there, but it's certainly not a slam dunk that giving people jobs keeps them out of trouble. And then the next thing I want to talk about very briefly is cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is one area where the evidence actually has been really strong. So CBT is a form of psychotherapy that helps patients identify negative or inaccurate thinking so that patients can respond to challenges in a more effective way. It can be administered one-on-one or in a group setting. In these trials, it's usually in a group setting. And this is the result of an RCT of a CVT program in Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. And what they found was this is the impact of returning to juvenile detention, the impact of the CVT program on returning to juvenile detention. So you can see the effects are all negative, statistically significant, going across months of release. It's a really big effect. So it reduced 18-month readmissions by 32% of the baseline, and the benefits and avoided social costs of crime were at least 5 times the cost of the program. So this program seemed really effective, and it's something I would kind of put in the mental health treatment category of potential interventions. We don't know if it actually helps people get jobs. That's a big open question here. This is a table from a review on prisoner entry that I did recently. There are a whole bunch of different potential strategies out there. There are a whole lot in this middle category where we just have mixed evidence or too little evidence to really have any idea whether they work. And so there's a lot of work to do, but certainly a lot of things that are much more worth trying than ban the box is. And so I'll leave you with just a few thoughts. So I think going forward, my takeaway from a lot of this research is that it could be that our emphasis on employment is just misguided here. I think there's a conventional wisdom that in order to reduce recidivism, we have to increase access to jobs. We have all those large-scale RCTs showing that transitional jobs for those coming out of prison has no impact on employment, has no impact on recidivism. So it might turn out that a job is nice to have, but is not necessary or sufficient to reducing recidivism. So addressing other challenges first, substance abuse, mental health issues, might make it easier to build a stable life that includes steady employment. And then more broadly, I think we just need to, in terms of the public conversation, we need to acknowledge that it's a really tough problem to solve. So we need to get serious about rigorously evaluating what we try, even in situations where we have some evidence that suggests an improvement. When I talk to policymakers, I tell them we should assume anything we try is going to fail. They should not be surprised and disappointed when something they've tried has failed. They should not consider that a failure of the entire experiment. We just need to figure out what doesn't work very quickly so that we can move on and try something else. And then the key is just to keep trying. And that's, I think, in the end, I'm very optimistic about this. I think there are a lot of smart people working on this stuff. I'm optimistic we'll find a solution, but we need to acknowledge when the programs that we're implementing aren't working in order to get there. And I'll leave you with that.
Do you want to take questions?
Sure. If there are questions, I'd be happy to.
Yes. Thank you so much. This was all a beautiful research and great talk. So I just first want to ask a couple of factual questions. Is there anything like a cap or a quota in the United States to employ people with criminal records, like giving this to the employers, state or private, for state or private jobs?
So requiring employers to hire a certain number of people.
Yeah, like 1% of your...
I have not heard of anything like that. So we have like tax incentives so if you hire someone with a criminal record, you can usually get some sort of tax credit from the government, but we don't have any, I have not heard of anything like a quota.
But because this is the case in some other European countries, I was wondering.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of employers would be very upset being told that they have to, by the government, they have to hire anyone, regardless of characteristics. So, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, this doesn't apply to small employers, but big
Okay.
employers, let's say a factory that employs more than 2,000 people, should employ some people with criminal records. So this is the one thing. And is there any data available on what kind of jobs we are talking about? Because you mentioned the thing about the education levels. This implies something, but is there any data about what kind of jobs these are, like mostly white-collar jobs or mostly service jobs?
It's mostly, so the short answer is that it's mostly entry-level jobs. Is what you should be thinking about for most of this stuff. The slightly longer answer is we don't really know because the data, again, are not good. We don't have a really good idea of kind of, if you look at the full population of Americans with criminal records, how where they're employed or where they would be qualified to work. But at least in places where we have some data from states, and certainly when you look at education levels, it suggests that people are going to be, these are low-level, entry-level jobs, so like food service, construction, those sorts of things.
I have another bigger, like a larger question, but I don't want to be like back and forth with you. So if you want to take other questions, maybe I'll ask at the end.
Yeah.
I know some states or localities have recently passed regulations about asking about past pay. It's not obviously the same mechanism, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about this idea of less information, does it lead to a similarly kind of negative outcome because of this statistical discrimination assumptions about women making less? You're nodding, so.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what policies you're talking about. They drive me crazy. Yeah, no, I think these policies they're based on a similar sort of assumption that like, if we don't like that employers ask about certain information, then we should just tell them not to use that information. And then everyone thinks, great, we solved the problem, we can all go home. Like that's the end of the conversation. And I think, the reason economists get ourselves into trouble is we say, no, that's not the end of the conversation. We want to know like what happens next, right? Like when you're not allowed to ask anymore, then what? And I don't know what the then what is. Like it's a slightly more complicated situation because you're going to wind up with it's going to matter how women are negotiating and how men are negotiating and all of that. But my hunch is that, if employers actually were using information about your wage history, and then they're not allowed to, they found it valuable, and then they weren't allowed to ask anymore, they're not just going to throw up their hands and pay everyone the same amount, right? Like they're going to try to guess whatever information they were using that for. It could be how much you're willing to work for. It could be some signal of productivity, depending on why they were using it, that will lead to different potential outcomes. But it seems very unlikely to me that the result is going to be that women are now paid the same as men. I also just think it's a funny policy because if I were to rank all the possible causes of the gender wage gap, employers asking about your previous wage would be like very low on that list. Like it just seems very unlikely this is like a major concern. But I think there is ongoing research on this. I think we will know the answer sometime in the future, but my hunch is this is not going to solve the problem that advocates were hoping to solve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming, Professor. I just had a question about the cognitive behavioral therapy that you mentioned quite at the end. You mentioned that chart was just for juvenile individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have that data set for the effects of therapy for adult incarceration?
Great question. So those, most of the research on CBT has been aimed at-risk youth, so like young men. So that could go up to like, 25 or so. So I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know of any studies that focus on adults, but there's no reason to think it couldn't also be effective for adults. I think we probably just don't have the study yet.
So even though we don't know the effects of it, do you think that would be reasonable to just bring to prisons and see if it would work?
Yeah, and I think the most people who are actively engaged in crime and at the highest risk for recidivating when they get out are still going to be on the young end of the spectrum. So, folks who are getting out when they're 50 or 60 are very low risk anyway. And so if an intervention is super effective with younger men, that is great. And that will get us, that's going to be a big win. But it certainly is something that when I talk to policymakers, I always list CBT as something that's very promising, and that if they're looking for things to try, I tell them to try it. I also always emphasize make sure to set up a way to evaluate it, because there's still a lot of things we don't know, including if we're going to scale it, we're probably not going to be hiring top-notch therapists for every group setting. We're going to have to kind of make compromises and hire people with less training, and that could reduce effectiveness too. So there are a lot of questions there, but it seems really promising and is definitely on a short list of things that seem to have some good evidence behind it.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was wondering, there was one graphic that you showed that showed the difference between rates of something for people who were committed to felonies and misdemeanors, but none of the other data you showed the distinction.
Yeah.
So, does the kind of crime that's committed have an effect on the hiring, and if so, what's the effect?
So I think that there have been similar studies on employment looking at misdemeanors versus felonies, and employers do distinguish between those things. Interestingly, I think most people would assume that I certainly would have assumed that employers would also distinguish between the type of crime in terms of whether it's a drug offense or property offense. Violent offense, they almost certainly would, although I'm not sure we actually do have actual research evidence on that, partly because, so in the Egan and Starr study, for instance, they just randomized whether you had a property or drug offense conviction, and they found no difference between those two groups. They didn't even bother including a violent offense because they just assumed that would be an instant no anywhere they sent that application, and they needed enough statistical power to write this paper, and so that they figured they'd just be throwing those applications away. So I think the short answer is that employers do pay attention to what the difference is between different offenses, but we don't. Our evidence is limited to these types of audit studies that have been done and exactly what types of crimes they were randomizing over. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming. Really enjoyed your talk. So you pretty much told us that we've tried this policy and it doesn't have the impact that we were looking for, that it's already in like 34 states, I think that was your statistic.
And counting.
And counting. So have you heard of any efforts or pushback against this on the policy side that would lead to people trying something else? Because why should we keep going if it's not working?
Actively hurting people who are already struggling in the labor market. Well, I talk as often as I can about how we should be repealing it. There's a big, at this point, there's a big ban the box lobby out there that I think has really gone all in on this policy. And in my view, they've taken their eye off the ball of, this the goal of the policy was to help people with criminal records, and we should maybe look at a different policy if this policy isn't working. I think their policy goal has been implementing this policy now. And so, some people just don't trust research evidence. So that's part of it. I think some people just don't want to lose the momentum. I think there is something about the ban the box movement that's been created, that this policy, as I said, the ban the box has become the slogan for sort of a social movement for second chances. And that is undoubtedly a good thing, right? The idea that we're having these conversations and employers are thinking more seriously about why they're worried about a criminal record can only benefit this broader push. Unfortunately, the policy itself is not good, right? And so you want the movement without the policy. I will say, as I go around and talk about this, more and more people have heard about the research. So that is, I feel like word is getting out in sort of the advocacy community that the research has been finding that it's not effective. But yeah, at this point, I don't know of any concerted efforts to repeal ban the box, although I think it would be a good idea. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. So I'm wondering what you think about the optimal set of policies given what you just said. So one option is that what we should really be doing is trying to appeal ban the box where it is, and stop it from becoming adopted where it isn't. And maybe also implementing some of the alternatives that you cited that are mutually incompatible with ban the box. Another option would be to say, well, ban the box is some places, so in those places we should be targeting reforms that are compatible with ban the box and might have positive interaction effects with it. So I'm just wondering if you had thought at all about what some of the costs and benefits would be toward having a reform package that took the evils or the bad parts of ban the box, but then tried to use settled policy instruments to push things in a different direction rather than going the repeal route.
So I will say, a lot of mostly lawyers by training who want to, their view is that this research does not show that ban the box is bad. It shows that people are breaking our anti-discrimination laws, right? So we know that racial discrimination is illegal. This research shows that employers are still discriminating based on race. And so if that's happening, that's illegal, and we should enforce those laws better. And my response is usually, let me know when you start the real enforcement, because I would love to write the paper about how we ended racial discrimination. Sincerely, I would love to write that paper. My prior is just, we're not going to be able to enforce our way out of this. So I think the options are, we can either accept that we're reducing employment for young black men by 5% a year and just shrug our shoulders and go try to spend money on other things to make up for it somehow. Or we can repeal the policy that's having this negative effect and go do things that are more effective. I don't know that I think, rehabilitation certificates and ban the box are fundamentally incompatible because it's less information, more information, right? You can't have both at the same time. There's certainly nothing fundamentally incompatible about ban the box and also investing in education, say. We could do both of those things. But we're still just leaving potential gains on the table by keeping the ban the box policy in effect. In my view, it's mostly just the egos of people who are pushing for the policy. They don't want to admit that it didn't work, and that strikes me as very unfortunate.
One of the things that was up there in the middle was expanding DNA database.
Yes.
Is that because, you know, there's a thought that maybe some people just shouldn't have been incarcerated in the first place? And if you had that, why was that there?
So I have other work on DNA databases. So there's kind of another. So you asked about the right one of those policies on that. Yeah.
Just jumped out at me.
Yeah. So DNA databases basically are if you are convicted or arrested for certain crimes, you're required to provide a DNA sample that goes into the FBI database, and that's kind of regularly compared with crime scene evidence. And so it increases the probability that you'll get caught if you commit another crime. I have research showing that if you're added to the database, recidivism drops dramatically. So knowing that you're more likely to get caught then has a big impact on your behavior going forward, which is really nice. You know, there are privacy costs to increasing the size of the DNA database, which is why we're not expanding it more rapidly. But it certainly is. It's another policy lever you could imagine using, and is I think similar to a lot of other high-tech tools where by increasing the probability that you can get caught for crimes, we can deter a lot of crime. So it's a type of policy that seems to be really effective, but is very different from all these other things we're talking about.
Well, thank you very much. That was great. Really interesting talk.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.